Hello. So far in your reading, we've been discussing, in the class, we've been discussing different aspects of the Bible and modern science, and up till now, we've been talking about the conflict between evolution and the Bible, or evolution and the creation stories. And the problem often arises that people will say, well, I believe the Bible, and that settles it. And the Bible is written by God, and therefore, anything else that man comes up with should be discarded. And a person of faith might say that. The problem is that just because reason alone doesn't arrive at matters of faith doesn't mean faith has to discard reason. So maintaining a reasonable faith is actually very important. Otherwise, there's no reason for people of faith within a world governed by reason. And you certainly don't want to make faith irrelevant and completely passe and archaic in a world in which where reason reigns supreme. So just because reason alone doesn't arrive at matters of faith doesn't mean faith has to be unreasonable. Consider the following. What we've discussed about hermeneutics and responsible interpretation of the Bible would lead us, or it leads me specifically, to look at the book of Genesis as the opening chapters of Genesis as telling stories or offering how the world is supposed to go, or the way the world works, the way God operates in the world, largely in symbolic form, both with the creation stories of Genesis 1 and then the creation story of Genesis 2 and 3 in the garden, two separate creation stories that have different points to make. Genesis 1 being a creation story that shows how God teaches monotheism. God alone creates all these categories of creation that are separated in a literary fashion by various days, versus the God in Genesis 2 and 3, which puts man, the man and woman, the primordial couple, within the garden and shows a more intimate process whereby the responsibilities of humankind are laid out in the managing of this sacred space of the garden and so forth. But these stories are meant to, in symbolic fashion, show what are the responsibilities of man in the overall scheme of creation and the responsibilities to God in that process. But those stories are not designed according to how I interpret the Bible and how I interpret those passages in their ancient Near Eastern context. Those stories are not designed to answer the science questions that skeptics of the 19th and 20th centuries were posed upon it. So therefore, supposedly the conflict between Bible and science, or specifically between evolution and creation, is an artificial one that is solvable by simply saying the Bible in those instances are answering bigger questions that evolutionists than whether or not evolution is true. It's actually answering more private, more personal, more faith-based questions and leaving the science to things that man might discover. Now, having said that, we're on to a new category in terms of how science and faith interacts even now. Is there a conflict between science and faith? And to what extent, when someone is looking at science, to what extent do they simply set science aside and punt to faith when it gets convenient? This leads me to one of the sections within your McGrath book, specifically chapter 18, in which it deals with Richard Dawkins and the issue of scientific atheism. Now, it's important to understand that science has to deal in the area of materialism. Now, what do I mean by materialism? I'm talking about in science, it has to engage in what's referred to as a methodological materialism. Material meanings all there is material. A philosophical materialism is all there is material, anywhere, ever. That's a philosophical assertion, is that philosophical materialism is that all there is material. There is no God. But science, whether or not a person is a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, Hindu, has any faith at all, scientists always have to deal with methodological materialism. Now, what do I mean by that? You have to differentiate philosophical materialism and methodological materialism. Methodological materialism is that in your scientific methods of testing, hypothesis testing, experimentation, peer review, testing for the results, putting a theory in to see it confirmed by experimentation. In your methodology, all you have to work with is material. God does not get into your beaker or your petri dish or get into your scientific experiment. if theologians tell us anything about God, is that God is a metaphysical, if you're a monotheist, as the major Western traditions hold to, if you're a monotheist, meaning one God, that means that you believe in a metaphysical singularity who is accountable to no one, least of all you. So therefore, if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or someone who believes in one God, then that means that God is bigger than anything else, bigger than man, bigger than the earth, and does not conform themselves to any sort of scientific experimentation. Therefore, you cannot insert God into your scientific experiments, hoping that He will hoping that He will give you the right outcome. That's not science. That's some other religious ritual to which, from an anthropological sense, we can always ascribe some sort of label. But it's not science. Western science is predicated on the idea of knowing how the natural world works, meaning you only have to work with materials, chemical materials, geophysical materials, meteorological materials. You only have to deal with the natural world, the material world as it exists. God does not jump into your experiment for you. Therefore, whether you are a person of faith or whether you are a dyed-in-the-wool atheist, you have to engage, for science sake, you have to engage in methodological materialism. You can only work with stuff in order for it to be science. It doesn't matter whether you're a person of faith or not. It doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. You can only do science with materials. So therefore, you must engage in a methodological materialism. All science engages in this, whether or not they have any sort of faith or not. Now, where the leap comes from is where someone who has to deal only with methodological materialism makes the philosophical leap or the logical leap into methodological materialism, saying this: since in science I only can deal with methodological materialism, that's all there is to work with. All there is in the universe is material. There is nothing else beyond it. That's a philosophical assertion that cannot be proved. In essence, it's a statement of faith. So you can say in your science, I only worked with these materials, and you can say that with relative certainty. But to say, I only worked with these materials is verifiable by what you can observe. It's verifiable through the senses. It's evidential. There's evidence for that. But then to say, because I've not seen God, because I've only seen materials, because I can only measure materials through telescopes, through various different meters, through indicators of different types, then there's nothing beyond it. That is where the logical leap takes place. Now, there's nothing wrong with philosophical materialism per se. This is a university. A person can be a person of faith, they can be an atheist, they can hold to whatever philosophical set of assumptions that they want to. There certainly is freedom to do so. But you must acknowledge the difference between philosophical materialism and methodological materialism. So science, in utilizing methodological materialism, it does not require you to be engaged in philosophical materialism. Those are separate categories. Therefore, a person can be a responsible scientist and be a person of faith, saying, I can only work with materials in my experimentation. But I'm willing to assert, as a matter of philosophy, that there is something more beyond that which I have to work with. And I'm not going to punt to faith just because I don't have the results that I want. I'm also not going to punt to state assertions of faith on things I have not yet proved. So, for example, we don't punt to matters of faith and say, well, just because I haven't proved it yet doesn't mean I can assert it. No. Still, matters of faith are going to wind up having to have their own type of internal integrity, and say, by what rationale do you say that? Well, by faith I assert that there are Martians on the other side of on somewhere on Mars, and we just haven't found them yet. Okay, fine. You're willing to believe that. You're welcome to believe that, but who else believes it with you? And by what rationale do you say that? Well, I just believe it. Fine. We still can ask, by what rationale do you believe that? If you ask a Christian, because this is on the class on the Bible and modern science, if you ask a Christian, by what rationale do you believe that, they can say, oh, I got to be honest with you, I can't prove any of it. But there is, based upon these writings, with this testimony from these writers, these events that happen in history, and they give you a rationale for that, then you say, okay, I can see where you're coming from that. I don't have to believe it along with you, but I see your rationale. That's matters of faith, but at least still, faith has its reasons. So keep in mind that whether it's matters of faith, it's going to have some sort of rationale behind it. But still, in matters of science, methodological materialism is showing your process. In essence, if you ever took a math class when you were younger and they said show your work, science must show its work. It can't just throw God into where the holes exist. So therefore it has to engage in methodological materialism. But that's different from philosophical materialism, that somehow now makes the faith assertion there is nothing beyond the material in the universe. That's where the separation takes place. That responsible science does not require atheism. In like manner, it's not necessarily more scientific to declare, it's not necessarily more scientific to declare that there's nothing but material. Good science is going to engage in methodological materialism regardless of what you hold as a matter of philosophy. All right, I just want to throw my 2 cents in there for you as part of your discussion.